Hi, I'm Marla Shaivitz, and I'm presenting my MLA capstone project, Class-Based Differences, as a component of corporate diversity discourse, an investigation of its absence and argument for inclusion. My capstone research argues for an intersectional diversity discourse alongside race and gender, one that includes social class advantages and disadvantages, and cites evidence as to why this is critical in the domain of the workplace. This paper contains new analysis of 84 diversity statements to investigate whether current efforts take class-based differences into consideration. The purpose of this paper is to make explicit the need to identify the intersection of class as a neglected area in workplace diversity practice and illustrate why it is important to include. This paper is a synthesis of interdisciplinary research that includes foundational articles on the topic to the post-2020 calls for a radical shift in diversity discourse. This argument is made in two parts. The first part is an investigation of the absence of class-based diversity discourse via an investigation of existing research. The second is an argument for inclusion using both research and real-world examples of effects of the absence. Scholars agree that diversity is a descendant of affirmative action and equal employment laws, and the addition of new identities has diluted the original intent of providing equity for African Americans and women in the workplace. There's also general agreement that diversity as a concept is vague, amorphous, and open to interpretation by those espousing it. There is disconnect related to it regarding workplace diversity efforts that has been documented for 30 years. There's also a proliferation of research that not only questions the effectiveness, but supports the position that diversity training does not produce meaningful lasting change and can activate stereotypes and produce backlash. Recent academic literature, that is post-2020, builds off previous research indicating deficiencies in workplace diversity efforts, and calls to acknowledge class-based inequities have a long history. The definition of the term diversity holds multiple and conflicting meanings with just as many, if not more, stakeholder groups who claim ownership over the term and offer their own interpretations of it. While organizations have poured money into workplace diversity training, a McKinsey study estimates about $8 billion a year is spent on diversity trainings in the United States alone, academic research is clear there is a disconnect and little gain. This is where the radical call comes from academia for an intersectional discourse. Existing literature indicates a call for critical diversity, that is, a look at all forms of inequality and oppression. There are countervailing forces at work when it comes to diversity as a concept, with multiple claims around its meaning. Academic literature in the last 2 years has coalesced around class as a dimension of diversity. And there are academic arguments against the idea that diversity is, quote, good for business. And academic arguments also dispel the myth of meritocracy, and that is the idea that with simply hard work and a good work ethic, someone will get ahead. What is new about my research is that the paper analyzes the top 50 diversity statements from a website called Diversity Inc. And there are 34 notable mentions that are also analyzed. By analyzing the text of these diversity statements, it illustrates the disconnect between what academic research is calling for in terms of building effectiveness and doing diversity and what is actually happening in the workplace. The analysis of the statements, as well as 2 examples of warnings from academia manifesting itself in the world of work and drawing insights from the interdisciplinary study of psychology, sociology, and organizational studies, is an original approach that I take in my work. Examining the words of the diversity statements exemplifies the disconnect between research and practice. And note that these are current diversity statements from the years 2021 and 2022. My paper argues for an intersectional diversity discourse alongside that of race and gender, one that includes social class advantages and disadvantages, and cites evidence as to why this is critical in the domain of the workplace. And the paper also claims an intersectional approach to workplace diversity, including class, is that it's necessary to truly tackling inequality in the workplace, to move past vague statements toward a more meaningful examination of difference and opportunity. The paper also seeks to demonstrate the critical nature of moving the idea of intersectional diversity from research to practice, using the workplace as an example. It is important to note that there is no intent to diminish the focus on historically discriminated against populations or argue for a colorblind approach. A multicultural discourse in conjunction with a discussion of power and privilege is argued for, with the intent to add nuance, specificity, and definition to current diversity discourse. So I mentioned that in my work, I conducted a text analysis of 84 different corporate diversity statements. Diversity statements are where theory meets practice. These statements came from a website called Diversity Inc., and their top 50 companies for diversity. I analyzed it with the tool Voyant to analyze top repeating words as well as the relationships between the words. I also analyzed Diversity Inc.'s noteworthy companies for diversity, and this was a sample size of 34, and I analyzed this by close reading. My findings, so just as Paul Ingram's 2020 study found by analyzing these statements, I also found that there was no mention of socioeconomic class in any of these statements. And the most important takeaway, this is the most important takeaway, regardless of the calls from Ingram himself and other academic researchers, there are still no direct references or mentions of class-based differences in any of the top 50 statements or the noteworthy companies. Diversity statements, remember, are carefully crafted public relations efforts, so it should come as no surprise that the most frequent words in the corpus of the 11,180 total words are diversity at 142, diverse 95, inclusion 90, equity 74, people 66 mentions, 55 mention of the word employees, 52 mentions of the word community, followed by business, talent, commitment, and workforce. Often the name of the company appears several times in a diversity statement and in the word count. In an analysis of the 2022 list of noteworthy companies, one company, Ulta, recognized access to capital as a barrier to equity for founders of color, with the other statements utilizing the familiar non-intersectional diversity discourse. 4 of these statements mentioned a non-specific recognition of different backgrounds. One cited educational difference, perhaps a proxy for socioeconomic class, but not explicit. Now, these statements are where theory meets practice. The language is laudable, lofty, and in many cases unquantifiable. An area for additional study would be the execution of these efforts in the workplace through training programs. There are excellent studies on the lenses used by specific companies, Poster in 2008, Berry in 2015, that tease out the unique cultural traits of an organization. Poster examined discourse within 2 divisions of the same company, one in the United States and one in India. For the US-based company, gender was the lens influencing diversity discourse, and in the Indian subsidiary, it was race and ethnicity. And the study found managerial influence was exerted to drive situational discourse. Now that we've seen that socioeconomic differences are not a part of the discourse of diversity, let's turn to the reasons why this might be the case. First, organizations themselves are crafting diversity statements and programs voluntarily. There is often little oversight or accountability for meeting stated goals, if stated goals are even present. Next, A person's socioeconomic background is not obvious always when you look at them, as class is not a primary identity like race or gender. Class is often a categorization. For example, in economics or politics, you'll hear about the white working class, but it's not like people identify themselves in this way. Class is also not a protected category under employment law, and we've established the roots of the diversity movement lie in affirmative action and employment law, which protects against discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, sexual orientation, or gender identity, national origin, age, which is 40 or over, disability, and genetic information, including family medical history. Continuing on with reasons why this discourse might be missing from diversity statements, class is a difficult subject to discuss. Simply put, it's difficult for Americans to discuss this. It stirs up issues of power and sometimes unearned privilege. In studies, respondents have shown time and again they simply don't know where they fall. Lower income people call themselves middle class, as do upper income people, and the data on income inequality in the U.S. show the strata. The myth of meritocracy is something that many corporations operate under, and it's a tool that hides racism and, more broadly, inequality. Peggy McIntosh, the well-known researcher of race, defines the myth of meritocracy as the myth that all democratic choice is equally available to all, and this extends into the realm of business. The reproduction of oppression and subjugation subtly perpetuated through organizations hiring for culture fit demonstrates organizations are not the meritocracies they might think themselves to be. One bold diversity statement in Diversity Inc.'s noteworthy list claims to, quote, empower diversity with meritocracy. How, you wonder? The statement continues, quote, through our inclusive human resources policies based on meritocracy, we regularly evolve our tactics at all levels of the company to ensure our actions remain effective in promoting equality of opportunity. Considering societal conditions of inequality and inequity, claiming meritocracy as the engine of diversity is indeed bold, and a study of this organization's particular culture would be an area for further research. Several researchers cite the performative nature of workplace diversity, that efforts are for show and not for effectiveness, and the sincerity of these efforts has been questioned as to whether companies really want to dismantle racism or whether they are simply performing, quote, woke washing to appear relevant or to increase sales. Now we know that scholars are calling for an intersectional approach, including class, and in practice, there is no acknowledgement of class-based differences or socioeconomic advantage and or disadvantaged, and we've examined the possible reasons why these are absent in diversity statements. Why is this an area to include? Why is this being argued? The reason why is that there are advantages to including class as an intersectional element of diversity discourse. These insights have been gleaned from a body of research, from organizational studies and psychology, and it is critical to demonstrate these advantages. First, including class in the discourse expands opportunities. One study found that only 25% of people working today were raised by at least one parent with a degree, indicating that a majority of the workforce is from an academically defined lower socioeconomic background. Acknowledging the myth of meritocracy and not prejudging based on educational background, perhaps where a person went to college, expands opportunities. Studies have shown that in the position of leadership, that those in the position of leadership who hail from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more empathetic leaders. Work style has been shown to be different among those from different socioeconomic classes, where those from lower socioeconomic classes are drawn toward a team-based approach and collaboration over those from higher socioeconomic classes, whose style is more individualistic. And broadly speaking, expanding opportunities for more workers addresses issues of income inequality, whereby more people are afforded higher paying opportunities and perhaps management positions. Rarely is workplace policy on display as it was in September 2020, weeks before the presidential election, when the Trump White House released a memo titled Training and the Federal Government. It is a stunning display of discourse manipulation. In this statement, not even the traditional protected categories are mentioned. And the biggest omission of all is gender. Quote, "We can be proud that as an employer, the federal government has employees of all races, ethnicities, and religions." Unquote. It is difficult to know what type of training was conducted here, but this discourse is indicative of a discourse solely of race, and this memo clearly takes political liberties. This is the first in the series of statements from the Trump administration demonstrating how the discourse of workplace diversity can be contrived to serve not a multicultural agenda, but a political one. It is a stellar example of managerial discretion in directing discourse and efforts, with the manager as the head of the government. The second part of this series, stemming from grievances over workplace training, challenges the critical view put forth by proponents of multicultural diversity. The document is an outward nod to American exceptionalism, stating, and I quote, "Those events establish a clear historical record of an exceptional nation dedicated to the ideas and ideals of its founding." The embellished language of the executive order echoes the Enlightenment ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it calls to mind arguments in the research that I found around symbolic elements of diversity discourse. It tries to create a common American narrative, glossing over historical injustices to create an American story for children, essentially creating a historiography, exactly the accusation that the administration made against the 1619 Project. This is the astonishing leap from discourse to political action. One sentence speaks to that American values are enacted at a local level. So the federal government is advocating for advocacy at the school board level. The statement is a restoration of American education grounded in the principles of our founding that is accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling must ultimately succeed at the local level. Parents and local school boards must be empowered to achieve greater choice and variety in curriculum at the state and local levels. The executive order and memorandum and the third document in the series, the 1776 report, are all discursive. They are void of substance, and their vagueness invites agreement of supporters to ignore the issue at hand, the historiography and lasting effects of slavery and discrimination and its present manifestation. This type of discourse has been termed as racial neoliberalism. This vagueness, the absence of race in discourse, is buoyed by the logic that when there is no race, there is no racism, and anyone who does mention it is a traitor against American ideals. This is a demonstration of the importance of precision and language when articulating goals of diversity. The 1776 report calls for the expansion of discourse on diversity, and probably close to the thesis of this paper, but the report is posited in a non-evidentiary way and couched in racist dog whistle rhetoric. The Trump administration uses this opportunity of a report to, quote, warn about the notion of fascism, as well as other right-wing talking points in passages on Marxism, communism, the role of the family, and identity politics. This is used to tie critical diversity efforts to these right-wing boogeymen. Like the executive order, the use of American iconography as symbolism is peppered throughout. This is pointed to as a trait of a colorblind approach to diversity. Another recent example also points to discourse around colorblindness, which again ignores race and therefore the barriers faced by those who experience racial discrimination. This trilogy of executive action is one of many assaults on diversity discourse. Another can be seen in a November 2022 statement by Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas during opening arguments in the case Students for Fair Admissions versus the University of North Carolina, which is a case deciding the fairness of affirmative action practices in university admissions. Thomas employs a colorblind approach utilized by neoconservatives. The colorblind approach to diversity is where one argues they, quote, don't see color, and that stance diminishes the historical discrimination faced by people of color. What he is doing is that he's exploiting the vagueness in discourse, the discourse around diversity. His statement, quote, I've heard the word diversity quite a few times, and I don't have a clue what it means. It seems to mean everything for everyone. This is a rhetorical challenge. Admissions decisions related to universities only take a few years to reveal themselves in the workplace. This, again, is where theory meets practice, because there will be real-world consequences. In conclusion, current diversity statements show that even though a call for broader discourse has been made in academic research, it is not being heeded. There are benefits to workers and the workplace to including socioeconomic class-based differences in diversity discourse. The current situation is producing deleterious effects to those championing a multicultural concept of diversity. And areas for further research for future scholars include analyzing the diversity statements of universities, whether broadening the discourse of diversity work to include class mitigates the effect of backlash, as well as examining the first-generation college student as an identity. Champions of the ideals of diversity and multiculturalism must know when and where to apply precision of language. In the broad view of diversity discourse, this precision is needed to ward off criticism. Naysayers use the fluidity of the definition to suit their own ideologies and agendas, and plenty of well-meaning leaders put forth weak, amorphous corporate diversity statements. There is a need to recognize the intersectional aspect of diversity related to social class advantage in workplace diversity efforts. Employees in all workplaces, private companies, and public entities arrive with differing socioeconomic backgrounds. In the discourse of diversity, the needs and values of those disadvantaged by socioeconomic circumstances must be acknowledged and addressed to foster inclusivity.